Welcome to this masterclass in which you will learn how to compose and orchestrate in an epic style. It is filled with wonderful tips and techniques that you can apply right away, so let's jump right into the content. Marc, may I ask you a question? Is there any specific reason why you wrote this whole thing in B flat major, but the whole piece is actually in E major?
No, it's a mistake.
Okay. I thought this was one of the brilliant orchestration things that I don't understand. That is the overall orchestration. Great work, Marc. What I first want to point out, and that is something that I, at this point, see a few of you guys do, which is fantastic, by the way. If you want to blur your runs, use, for example, these tuplets in 7 or 5 or maybe 9 if you want to have more notes, because you don't get a clear sense of the rhythm this way. And especially in the beginning here with these 7 tuplets, you have no idea what the rhythm is until you hear it in the other instruments. So let me just show you this run in the beginning real quick here. And that is really cool. So if that was in plain 16th, let's say, it would lose this blurry feeling a little bit. So what I also want to point out, and Marc, by the way, if you want to add something, again, please interrupt me at any time. That is much appreciated. Then this brassy moment right here, this is purely what will grab your attention because the brass section is the strongest one anyway. Let's just have a look at what is happening around it, because up to this point, you won't hear anything else, hardly anything else. So in this moment right here, this is just more or less a pedal. So nothing happens in the woodwinds. And in the strings down there, if I would play just the strings, let's say, at this point, this is the moment where everything leaves the room, so to speak, for the brass section, so that the brass really can make an impact. Especially this rhythmic thing here, that is really great. So let me just grab the brass real quick. That is really cool. Love it, Marc. Really love it. Also that you bring in the French horns a little bit later. Actually, the impact is not that dramatic, so the French horns probably could have started on the 1 as well, but still, they add a little bit of a something just a moment later. From this point on, right here, everything is more or less one big unit because of the rhythmic thing right here, which is also something I want to show you. So let's go with the tuba. Here we go. When it gets to this moment, that is actually interesting. And the way how Marc constructed the whole motor and the energy is, I would say, very close to the Overtone series. In 2 aspects, actually. The first aspect is how Marc voiced this whole thing in the brass. So down here you can see that is the root tone, and I can make this a bit bigger here. That's the root in the tuba. Let's go with this view so that you can read the instruments. Then we have right here the bass trombone, then the trombones. And as you can tell, this is the root, this is the root, that's the root. Here we have scale tone 5 and 6. Then in the trumpets, we have scale tone 6, 2, and 5, right? And it continues this way in the other trumpets right here. You have a lot of trumpets, Marc. Then we have 5, 1, and 5 again. And those French horns, they are a little bit separated right now. But if you just listen to this whole note structure here, this is nothing else than more or less the Overtone series with one exception. And I'm getting to this in a second. sounds pretty massive. So the only thing that is missing in here is actually, and now I'm going to mess with your piece, is actually this guy. That is scale tone 3 to the root tone. And this is not showing up anywhere. And it's actually not showing up in the brass. It's also not showing up in the strings or the woodwinds. So this gives this more or less hollow feeling to this rhythm or this motor, which is interesting because you can use this to build anticipation. The moment Marc resolves this hollow structure here into the plain triad, it has a bigger impact this way because he omitted scale tone 3 for a long time, actually for, I don't know exactly, but 8 bars or something like that, which is really great. So that is the first aspect of the overtone series that I mentioned. It's the voicing and the register. The second aspect is the complexity in the motor. Let me demonstrate this to you. So if I go down and I want to quickly grab all the bass instruments first. So we have the double basses, the timpani, why not? We have the tuba and we have something on top, the contrabassoon. And I'm going to play this real quick and you will hear the bass instruments first. Okay, so it's a very easy to follow, slow moving pulse almost. Now let's go into the next higher register. Let's see what happens there. We have the cellos, we have the bassoons, this guy, that is happening here. So this, as you can tell already, is at a higher pace and has more energy to it, which is great because this is more or less how the overtone series is structured. You have the easy to follow things down there, which is the root basically, and scale tone 5. And the higher you go, the more complexity you get. And that is also true in the rhythmic construction here, what Marc did. So the next higher thing then, let me go to this guy, which is the violas. Exactly. And this, I believe, is doubled by the oboe. Yep. So that's oboe and violas. Again, if you compare this to the lower rhythms that we've had, this has more energy and it has a different pulse. Now we're looking at those triplets against the 8th and 16th down there. These polyrhythms, you can get away with this if you structure them into different registers and just build them from lower complexity at the bottom to higher complexity as you move up the register. And let's just continue our little explorations here, which is now the rest of the instruments. So I'm going to go with the flutes. That should be the clarinet.
There is 3 flutes, 3 clarinets, because they need to compete with full orchestra. Sometimes one play, one stop. Like can you go down to the strings? Because on the strings, I could do that. One is playing, one is bracing. Because I had only one. I didn't want to have too many lines on the score. And I explained that we alternate between the 3. You can go up. And I wrote that alternate. Always 2 on each note. But if I have I will rewrite for a real orchestra if I have to do that.
Yep, that is a good point. Also, an interesting part, look at this thing right here. Then here.
It's to have some breath.
Otherwise, the piccolo flute player probably won't make it till the end. But one thing that is interesting, what you just explained, Marc, I want to actually show you the first and the second violins separated, just because of the sound this creates, because it almost goes into mixing right now. This is actually part of production, and probably Olivier can also talk about this, with the slight variation in violins 1 and 2 at the moment. You will hear that this almost creates something like a ping pong effect. And if you listen to this via headphones, then you will hear it a bit clearer. I will show you this thing right now. So here we go with just the violins. A lot of synth programmers would do this with an LFO and just automate the pan knob. And it has a very similar effect, of course, but this is done purely with orchestration. Again, as you can tell from the energy and the rhythmic structure, this is really on top of everything else, because now you hear this constant pulse, so to speak, in these tuplets in sixes, which is really fantastic because it sits on all of these other rhythms very nicely. So before I actually show you how these rhythms flow into each other when we combine them, let me just play you this thing right here, and I'm gonna include the clarinets as well. Here we go. So that's the same line in all of those instruments. And it looks complex, right? If you look at the score and you see all of these black dots right here in the strings, it really looks complex. Although this is just one line and it's the same thing as done in the woodwinds. If you look at this score with the idea of, this is just doubling for color or for strength, then you recognize actually it's not that complex anymore. It reduces the complexity quite a bit. Let me show you how this works together with the oboe right here. And I want to stick to the woodwinds only so that I don't have to scroll all the time. We could have gone to the strings for that example, but let's stick with the woodwinds real quick. The funny part is, again, no scale tone 3. In all of those parts. Nothing. Also down there, if you want to listen to the same thing in the strings, here we go. Obviously, we don't have something that was played by the clarinet up there, which was this line in an octave position down. That's not happening right here. That is why you can hear the violas a bit more separated and clearer. But the point is really, let's go with the next lower layer right here in the rhythm, which was the cello part. And this emphasizes more or less on every downbeat and upbeat. So at this point, a 4 on the floor. And then to give this a bit more structure, we have the bass instrument. It's not that complex anymore, right? And now that we have all of these different layers, now it makes perfect sense that we have to have something next to this, which is a line. That's the easiest answer to, well, what can we do against this? It's always a line, believe me. And in this case, that is happening in the French horns. And this brings me now to the French horns. Let me first play this real quick here. Again, no scale tone 3, which would have been the G sharp. And this now sticks out as the one line, but it still remains very hollow. And this is why that pulse or this motor section here creates anticipation. You can write these 4 bars without saying anything. And that is exactly what happened in the sketch down there. Essentially, nothing. I'm sorry, Marc, but...
I like to have nothing to write.
Oh, this is really great. I love it. So then once we have this line established right here in the French horns, now let's bring in another thing. And look at the rhythm. Marc actually catches those things in the 2-bar and the timpani, because it is a very low line that starts happening here in the bass trombone and the trombones. So this is really nothing else than scale tone 1, scale tone 5. This one right here, scale tone 4 actually, a substitute almost for scale tone 3. Scale tone 4 is actually a good choice if you want to stay in that hollow and open sound. So that is why the A works great, because the E is pretty high here. When the E goes down to these guys, now it makes sense to go with scale tone 2. Let me just show you this line isolated real quick before we go into the other parts. And I want to include the trumpets because they just imitate that line and repeat it. Yep. If we now listen to this whole motor section here, and I actually want to exclude the brass real quick, just to show you what the brass really add to this whole thing. Now it sounds like the news, where you don't know exactly how much time you need for the host or the speaker. So this can be an endless pattern of a news show or something. But with these lines in here, you actually get to a point, a musical point. So let me bring that back. And what is also interesting in that context, now that we focus on the brass, really pay attention to these whole notes right here, because they act as the glue into this motor, and then it fades out and you recognize that this bar is pretty empty. But when the bass trombone and the trombones come back, then you will recognize them. They add something again to the body of sound and to the lower register, obviously. So they bring back the power. So let me play this from here. That's the big resolution here, Marc, where we actually get to hear our major chord. And in this case, now you're actually playing an A major. It's not E anymore. So, which is also interesting. The E that we have established as the tonal center worked now as the dominant that leads into the A. That's the big resolution. And at this point, the orchestration has to change. It really has to. There is no sense in continuing this pattern right here, neither in the woodwinds or the strings down there. Every section is doing something different. The strings, actually, that's the classic Hollywood orchestration. Let them play one line all in unison, and you have to do this if you want to hear this line. The first and second violins, the violas. You could have actually put the cellos also on the violas right here. But honestly, I don't think this is really needed because, yes, you also put a little bit of a high EQ on everything and make it a bit softer. So let me actually show you first how the woodwinds change. Let's focus on the woodwinds, and I'm going to play this from here, and we will transition into the climax. So the whole rhythmic energy, obviously, now is being released completely. We run into a lot of whole notes, the complete opposite of what happened before. The same is true in the brass. We had a lot of rhythmic figuration right here, and now this is all released. Interestingly enough, let's go to the strings because they feature this line right here. This is the strings section. Yeah, and all together with this movement around the brass section, now this makes this big chord in the brass more interesting. It's interesting, right? Because what you hear is actually the line in the horns. But when they get to this point right here, this is the moment where they are really powerful. Actually, you could have added some more woodwinds to the horn, but you decided, Marc, to go with chords for coloring the brass section.
I just let the flutes over the French horns, but it could have been more woodwinds. No problem for that.
Yeah. Well, and this is really interesting because flutes over French horns are always elegant. That's always a fantastic combination. Let me first play the French horns on their own. And now let's make them a little bit brighter. Yeah, here they are doing something different already. So that is all more or less brightening the horns, especially in that register. So here we go. Yeah. And these things right here, they are just breaking up the chord, running into chord tones with a little bit of DPTs. And this is all coming from position change, right? So that is why we are dwelling quite a bit in some of the lessons on position change. And TC is a big, big lover of position change. And this is not a joke. He starts with just position changing his musical idea. And he puts stuff through root cycles or chord progressions using position changes and move into different registers so that he get inspired. You can always connect those position changes later with DPTs or line movement, whatever. This is all not a problem. And in the end, it might look like a line which is not based on position change anymore. But guess what? Originally, in almost every case, it was, since that's the easy way to get there. You don't have to change your harmonic structure. Just move your position changes around and then connect the line. And that is way quicker than figuring out what you want to do. And in terms of the energy, have a look at the brass section. They kind of fade out right here. But the moment they do, have a look at the woodwind section. And almost obviously the strings as well. So they bring in their moment here. And they go almost contrary to the brass. Just a held note. And then here it's empty. And we only hear the strings and the woodwinds. So let's see how we can bring down the energy after the climax again. The funny part, this is all imitation. I don't know exactly. A few months ago, we had this line writing imitation workshop. So that is exactly what Marc did right here. And it's a good way to bring down the energy. You just imitate your line in different registers using different instruments. This always works. This is like clearing the way for another section to come in, which happens right here with the trumpets and the trombones. So that's the typical big band type of writing where you have the trumpets and the trombones play either in unison or in octaves. It's a very strong combination actually. But this is what you get to hear in big band writing. Let's go from bottom to top. And I want to actually start right here. Let's start with the woodwinds and how they go down in energy the moment the brass section comes back. Yep, I don't want to talk about the ending right now. In a sketch, this would look very simple. Very simple. It's almost just one line throughout the whole sketch with a little bit of a chord structure, in this case an A major. But that's essentially it. Well, in this case, I can show you the sketch, of course. But that is why the meter sketches always look very sparse. But in this case, you don't need more, honestly. You could have put the line into this thing right here to indicate the change of register if you want to go down, because this one actually goes up in the sketch. But that's your artistic choice in the end, right? So you can decide what you want to hear in the end and already indicate this in the sketch. That is what I would do actually, so that you don't have to think about your sections later after, you've closed it for 2 weeks and then you come back to your sketch and you have literally no idea what you had in mind back then. So to avoid this trap, just put a little bit more information in case you have something specific in mind. I know that Marc pretty much does these things on the fly because yes. I've seen him orchestrate a lot of pieces already. Marc is like the orchestration AI. You can always ask for variations and you will get enough variation.
What about the sketch? I didn't give more information because I wanted our members imagine their own work on that. Because if there is too much information, it's less interesting for them.
Let's quickly go to the brass section here and let's hear how they get down in energy and then come back. And especially this change of sound when you hear the trumpets and trombones, which are very powerful together, the horns chime in and imitate that rhythm. They actually also imitate the chord structures, I can see it, but we can zoom into this thing in a second here. All of this is literally just 2 chords. And that is also what is shown in the sketch right here. A little bit of movement, but that is nothing else than a 6/4 movement, right? Going back, or you can also call them returning tones if you want to. That is really stuff that you can add later. So essentially what we're hearing is an A major all the way through. And again, this imitation always works for the change of sound or color. This is probably just done for variation right here, so that Marc wrote this little pickup line into the chord again. Since right here it's always 3 parts, always triads throughout the whole 2 bars almost. So that is the first moment where stuff gets broken up a little bit into this line. You could have gone to your C sharp, but you did not do it, probably because of this guy down here, because the C sharp was already covered with that guy. So it's better to stay out of the way and use B right here. And just for curiosity, let me actually do this. And let's listen to this thing once more, now with the trombones down there, because I want to hear the C sharp from there. And now let's add a little bit of rub with this variation. Yeah, I like this better. I like the B better.
The B, it's another note. You don't have the B in the chord. Then it's another choice.
So I think the 2+5 or 5+2 or 5+5, which are all position changes, they work pretty well in the brass section, almost as well as the plain triads. So of course, if you want to go to scale tone 3 in this case, it would have worked the same way. It's pretty hard to mess it up if you stick to this 2+5 or 5+2 variation.
Yes, and I agree with Marc. Also, the B make 3 consecutive fifth, A, E, and B. So it's very powerful also because of this.
Absolutely. A little detail that I guarantee nobody will pick up if you changed it. But still, this is one detail that just adds up to a better experience, because it's not just this note, it's actually many notes that really give that character of this piece. Since Marc introduced the 2+5 or 5+2 in the beginning, where he consciously omitted scale tone 3, this brings back this sound just a little bit. It's a smart connector to what you did before, but it flies by so quickly. So I truly believe nobody's gonna recognize the change if this was a C sharp. I always take one section, and this may change. Can be the woodwind section, strings, or brass. I don't have a specific go-to section. And then I write something for that section. Usually that's the main part of the sketch. And then I look at what I did in the other sections, and I really imagine how interesting is that part for the musician. That is what I do, literally. I would go back and look at, for example, let's pretend Marc wrote the brass first right here, since that's a brass-heavy moment, as the whole piece is, of course. But let's just pretend this came first. Then to figure out the woodwinds, I would look back and look at those lines. Like, okay, is that interesting for the piccolo player? And then I realized, okay, he had a pretty high pace here and lots of notes. So let's give him a rest. And this is how I decide about contrast, so that this comes down right now to, these whole notes. Then let's have a look at the strings. Same thing. In this case, strings and woodwinds, they go hand in hand in that particular moment. But also, let's say Marc continued with the brass section and finished the piece in the brass section first, since that's a very wide space that he covered here in the range. So let's see what we can do around that. Okay, so we have right here just the support of the bottom end, which is important. If you have those high energetic brassy moments, you don't want to lose the double basses usually. And the cellos, they are an option. Usually you can just double them. If you also go with your DVC right here, then I would bring in the cellos for sure. I would not write DVC in the double basses because this also splits the power a little bit and it becomes more transparent, but it loses the power. And for that reason, I would bring in the cellos. I would probably also bring in right here the bass instruments from the woodwind section. And then I would again have a look at what was happening before. So at this point, when we move closer to the final chord structure, you want everybody has a part to play. Because if you imagine you were sitting in the orchestra playing, I don't know, the viola, let's say, and you look at the guy next to you, which is the violin player, he has a great part to play and he has fun and everything. You look to the other side and there is the cello player, he has something to play and he's happy, and you are sitting there waiting for the piece to end. And this is literally, you feel useless as a musician. For that reason alone, I would write a part that is interesting. I look at the whole section in terms of energy and how interesting it is. Also in the context of the whole piece, so that I don't just highlight the strings over 8 minutes and have the woodwind play a sideline only. Even if we use samples, I know it's a different setting and everything, and I agree it's not that important with samples, but still, the overall result, I truly believe, will be better from an orchestration point of view, because you literally created something that would sound great if played with a real orchestra. That is what I would do. And if you look at the strings, this is interesting for everybody. Also, if you look at the parts right here, this is a plain doubling of the whole line. But guess what? If you did not have a part to play as a viola player and you look around and everybody plays that line, and you obviously have a sense for orchestration if you play inside an orchestra since you've listened to so many pieces, right? And you get an idea of what is happening in those various sections. You figure out pretty quickly that you should have played that line too. It would have been better for the overall orchestration. Obviously, the musicians, they won't dare step up and talk to the composer like, well, guess what? You should have put in a part right here. They usually don't do it because they get paid for nothing, which is fine if they don't have to play. If it's a gig, they accept the money and they leave, which is fine. But if you are lucky, then you find a musician who actually tells you, well, guess what? This is not really good writing, especially in this epic orchestration right here. So if you look at whatever instrument, everybody has a part to play. Everybody. There is not one single instrument at the final chord who can't chime in and make this a great experience. That is really important, especially with this big orchestrations. So even if you just double that line that happens in other sections, please do it. That should be your low-level go-to option. If you know how to write interesting parts, then you won't necessarily double, because usually you only double for color or for power. And in this case, it's power. But if you hear harmony in one section, usually that's enough. And the perfect example for that is right here, where you have all the brass. That is, in this case, harmony. So you don't need more harmony. So that is now a choice. That is a choice of coloration. There are other solutions to that. You can write a side line, but guess what? Marc already has one line. He has a side line. So no need to have a third line in there. So yes, that's a choice. And no need to have another motor, because we just came from a motor over 8 bars. So let's bring in contrast. So I think, Marc, with that analysis right now, I think doubling is actually a better choice. Because I criticized that, but I mentioned that point that you use the woodwind section in that middle register here to color the brass. And with that explanation now, actually, I made it clearer for myself. Then one thing, because Greg, you mentioned the order of things. What I also do in the orchestration, and I'm pretty sure Marc does not need to do that because he is just way more experienced than I am, at least. I listen to all of those sections separately when I consider my work done. And then I realize, okay, this transition is not fluent, or at this point, the section does not sound complete, or I feel it's missing something here, or I run risk that the musicians will get mad at me because I maybe have not enough breathing rest points, or maybe the part is just boring that I wrote. And this is stuff that reveals itself if you isolate all of those sections. Just as a quick example, let's go with the strings because the ear won't get so fatigued by the strings. And you will hear how they change and they will sound complete in all of those different moments. Yeah, it actually works. If you look at the final chord structure in the strings, this is really just hitting on the root tone and scale tone 5 actually. But it sounds like one tone only because scale tone 5, as you know, and the root tone, they're very close to each other in terms of the overtones and they meld together. That's your power chord right there.
Because if you play a full chord, they will have less power. It's possible to do it, but I prefer having 1/5 always strong.
Exactly. And again, there is no need to bring in harmony right here because have a look at the brass. They cover the full harmonic range. There is no need to bring the strings in and reduce their strength by going into divisi or whatever. Just let them stress the final root tone. And a pretty similar thing happens right here in the woodwinds. So if you just listen to the final chord structure. Yep, just E's and B's. But it's enough because this is exactly what is needed to make the brass section sound fuller and not just to create this gray, muddy sound because everybody plays the same stuff, which would in this case be harmony.
It's clearer to do this way if you have a big final chord.
I think so. Marc wanted to have this very heroic feeling. Obviously, he went to a major sound. But just for fun, let's change it.
Let's go.
It actually sounds very interesting.
One thing, just before the climax, the last triplets it's a C chord over an E. You know, we change scales. It's not more the Dorian scale of E. It's the scale 1+4 of C, kind of, or E with Aeolian scale, if you prefer. But
right.
You already have the C. It is why I wanted to have the C sharp, the C natural, and again the C sharp.
Yeah, I see. Makes perfect sense. It still sounds very interesting to me. Let's hear this. Yeah, sounds like the aliens came back in Independence Day 3 or whatever the last movie is, 2, I believe. Not quite sure. But I won't save it with the C natural in here, Marc. One thing is just the rhythmic section, because you have especially the snare drum in there, which highlights some of those moments that happen here in the clarinets and the flutes. So they give a little bit of sharpness to the overall structure. But again, following the overtone series, and that happens in trailer music. And if you were to add big epic drums like taikos and bongos, congas, whatever you have, you also want to structure this. Like the big drums play more or less the easy to follow, simple rhythm. And then the higher you go in tuning with your percussion, the more complex things you can let them play. And this also happens right here. So the snare drum usually is the most complex instrument here if we just go with the cymbals, bass drum, and let's add the timpani as well. I know this is a tuned percussion instrument, but still. Let me play you this here real quick. Then we can probably skip all of these things here and then we come back for the ending. Yeah, let there be madness. Love it. But that is pretty much following the same idea that Marc used for the motor. Like simple stuff at the bottom, and then the higher you go, the more complexity you can add. And this is something you can't go wrong with. It doesn't matter if you build your percussion ensembles or even use this for a drum set. This is how you can use the different toms to create these great grooving rhythms. But that is, I believe, pretty much the end of this breakdown. So guys, do you have any questions right now that we can go into? Now Marc is here to reveal all the secrets next to, well, you have to work pretty hard. If you made it thus far in the video, then this only shows that you are really interested in becoming a better composer. Well, why don't you log into the Virtual Campus and say hi to me in person? I would love to hear about your story, and maybe I can even help you with your next steps to becoming the best composer you can be. So this was Frank. Have a wonderful day and see you in the next video.